Now you might think because basically every TRX 50 motherboard is ATX or larger than ATX that you get no case options. The Fractal North is not designed for ATX cases, and yet we're gonna be able to do it. We're gonna be able to do it with tower cooling, thanks to the Arctic 40UM, 64 or 128 gigabytes of Kingston Beast Fury memory. Yeah, well, Threadripper build time. This is a perfect choice for a 32 or a 24 core dev workstation. Also, the wood accents of the North, what's not to love? For our workstation, I'm going to use the ASRock TRX 50 WS. Strictly speaking, this is not really workstation. This is like enthusiast workstation, or I'm saving over $1,000 on my 24 core processor because I don't need 8 memory channels, or I'm not going to populate 8 memory channels, and gosh darn it, this is the system that I'm building. And that makes sense because in this chassis, you're going to be able to add PCIe Gen 5 storage through the MCIO connector, which is a unique feature to ASRock's motherboard. So when you put this motherboard in, it comes right up to the folded metal on this. The color scheme of this case makes it a little bit easier to see what you're going to deal with. So your cable routing, you will have to get creative. You're not going to be able to hide the cables like you would with a normal size ATX motherboard. But this is probably the most compact, but not overheating 32 core Threadripper build that you could build around the new Zen 4 7000 series Threadrippers. Now, one thing you're going to want to watch out for when you pick your power supply is to make sure that you get lots of extra PCIe 6-pin connectors. This motherboard actually has a lot, but the only one that you really should plug in is the one at the bottom edge front of the motherboard. Now, one of the things that I'm doing here is to try to cheat a little bit, is to preload my power cables, because you're never going to be able to get the power cables through after the motherboard is mounted. The connectors and stuff are too large. There might be enough clearance, maybe, to set the motherboard after the cables are already through. That's what I'm trying. It might not work out for us though. Well, a 24-pin motherboard power connector is just too large, but it seems like our CPU power connector, as well as our PCIe front connector, probably are going to be small enough to make this work. It's probably also worth mentioning the Fractal Torrent, which has 2 giant fans at the front. And if the North isn't all about your aesthetic, definitely also consider the Torrent. The Torrent actually probably has better airflow. Even though the top is solid, don't underestimate the power of 2 giant fans in the front. And the Torrent Compact is a very similar footprint and case size as the North. There's also the regular Torrent, which is quite a bit larger. Just something to consider. For the video card, I'm going to use the Taichi White 7900 XTX because it's a really fast video card, and I think it'll look good with the white accents, probably. I mean, let's face it, this build is going to get used around the Level 1 studio, and it's going to have all of its parts swapped probably about 5 times. The other thing to do with this kind of a build is to think creatively. Like your PCIe slot layout here, some of them are 4 lanes, some of them are 8 lanes, 2 of them are 16 lanes. And the 3rd slot from the bottom is actually where I'm going to stick the GPU. It's going to block some of my Gen 4 slots, but it's going to leave one X16 and one X8 slot free. And it's going to let our Gen 5 M.2 breathe a little better, because otherwise if you put it in the top slot, the GPU is right on top of that. And that can be a little tricky to ensure that you've got adequate airflow, especially if you're running a Gen 5 SSD like our Crucial T700. Now this makes a perfectly reasonable boot volume. I've only got the 1 terabyte version of this, but it can do 11.7 gigabytes per second raw transfer. It's a fast drive, don't get me wrong. I just need a lot more capacity. And for my capacity drive, it's also Gen 5, I'm going to use that MCIO connector with our Kioxia CM7. This is Gen 5. This can do not 11.7 gigabytes per second, but up to 14. Real world, in my testing on Windows, 12 is pretty doable. And I can get this in capacities up to 30 terabytes. This is a workstation class drive. Everything else here, I've splurged, yes, for this build, but this is what brings it all together. Because, oh boy, Gen 5 storage. Alright, let's get this buttoned up. Get it booted and get some of that beautiful B-roll. Boom, there you go. Perfect Linux or Windows workstation in the Fractal North with the 32-core Threadripper TRX 50 platform, the ASRock WS, and 64 gigabytes of memory. All the way up to 256 gigabytes is reasonably affordable. Would I recommend less than 4 DIMMs in this platform? Never. Don't ever put 2 DIMMs in this. Well, I mean, you always want to run this with 4 DIMMs. After using this build for a couple of days, I definitely think that if you repeat this build, it's going to be a good idea to add a couple of 120 or 140 millimeter fans in the top, probably as intake. I mean, this is a small mesh, and intake here and intake at the front is going to force a lot of warm air out the back. It's going to be better airflow overall. I'm not really seeing any thermal throttling, except for if you move the GPU up, you can cause SSDs such as the T700 to throttle. Interestingly, our Samsung 980 Pro doesn't throttle even without the extra fans. But I think if you're going to do this build, you really ought to throw in either a couple of high CFM 140 mil fans in the top, like I was saying before, or the front, or both. So yeah, we'll see. The Fractal fans, they're quiet, but they don't move a ton of air, but they are quiet. I'm Mortalist Level 1. This has been a quick build of the Fractal North Seasonic Kingston Fury TRX 50. High-end desktop is back.